It was never promised the life here on earth would be easy, but let's go on this journey together. You're listening to From Hurt to Hope. Welcome back to this episode of the From Hurt to Hope podcast. I feel like I have to give this a disclosure right off the bat. You guys, I just spent 2 hours on the phone with somebody that just needed to be talked to, needed some comfort, needed some encouragement. And I'm not kidding. The conversation on the phone just lasted 2 hours and 5 minutes. And I wouldn't trade that for the world. It was needed. And I got to preaching. I got to preaching today on the phone. I told my husband that I was going to be home 5 minutes ago. I'm not kidding. I'm looking at the clock. I told him I was going to be home 5 minutes ago, and I'm not home. I'm just getting started on this episode. I feel like I have to give it the disclosure that I am in the mood to preach. So this is something, like I said, I was just preaching for the last 2 hours. I was talking, I was encouraging, and I was just speaking. And my tone just might sound a little bit different. And that's probably why, is because I am warmed up, I am fired up, and I am ready to go. So today, I wanted to share the message about my life and my struggles with learning and being smart and believing who I am. For the longest time in my life, I felt like I was stupid. I mean, I know people don't like that word, but that's exactly how I felt. From a very young age, I felt like I was stupid. I felt like I couldn't learn. I felt like I wasn't teachable. I felt like I wasn't smart. I didn't think that I was ever going to amount to anything. And I want to share a little bit about that journey with you guys today. This is something that has really evolved in my adult life. And it's something that on the other side of it, I have been able to learn, and I have been able to grow from this. And it's been a really hard thing. I never thought that I would ever speak out on this, because I didn't want anyone to have in the back of their mind, like, well, deep down, she really is stupid. Deep down, she really doesn't know anything. So this is a very vulnerable place that I will be coming from today, but it's something that I have grown from. It's something that has hurt me, but I have been able to find hope. I have been able to find healing. So that's where I'm coming from on this, but it is a hard one to share. So this is my journey from hurt to hope. So as a young girl, I was just very energetic. I was really hyper. I do remember comments being made that, like, I needed to settle down and why is she so hyper? I was just a young, active girl. I mean, put me outside and let me run around all day and I would have done great. I think that a lot of times people identify little boys as being hyper, but I was probably like the little girl that was hyper. So that probably made it a little bit harder for people to grasp and comprehend or just accept, because I wasn't the little boy being hyper running around. I was the little girl. I loved just being outside. I loved playing. I loved going on bike rides. I mean, I remember as a kid getting up and going outside first thing in the morning and like taking my SpaghettiOs outside to eat them at lunchtime and not even wanting to sit inside to eat. And I remember like being outside all day long, really just going inside to get drinks in, to go to the bathroom. And then I was right back outside. I love to go. I love to just go and have something to do. I had a lot of energy as a kid. So when I was in school, I also had a lot of energy. I remember going to preschool and I did really great in preschool because, like, you know, it's all about like centers and activities and just going to the next activity and just constantly doing things. Like, now it's story time. Now it's sand time. Now it's time to dress up. And I did really good there. But when I started like school that was a little bit more structured, as far as like having to sit in a seat for multiple hours and having to sit there, and then there only being certain times of the day where it could go out and have recess, that's where it got a little harder for me. So there's two components to this. There's my home life, and then there's also my school life. So my home life was a little difficult right when I first started entering grade school. There was a lot of tension. Both of my parents worked full-time jobs. My grandma lived with us. She was very traditional and very structured and very set in her ways. And then there was my school life where I was trying to go to school and learn, and I was like trapped in these seats all day long, and I was learning different than other kids. So there's just two components to this that kind of just made it like the perfect storm. I had a lot of anxiety when it came around school. I was very anxious. I had a hard time separating. and I had a hard time like concentrating in school, and I wasn't comprehending the same way that all of the other kids were. So that was hard. But then also at home, I had anxiety. Like I said, it was, my parents, they were in their own season of struggle. I had a grandma that was really hard on me, and she'd yell at me before I was going to school. And I was scared to go to school. I was scared to get on the school bus. I didn't want to leave home, but then I had my grandma like yelling at me, you better get out there. You better get on that school bus. And I didn't want to stay home with her because she was mean to me. So I was just like in this really awkward, strange place where I was being pulled in every which way as like a 5-year-old. I go into school in kindergarten, and that was my first year that ended up being really hard for me, was kindergarten. I had a teacher who taught in the district for a really long time. I went into this classroom, and, it was a different flow. It was a different structure. So kindergarten was hard for me. I cried because I didn't want to go into kindergarten. I didn't want to go to school, but I also didn't want to stay home with this grandma who, was really strict and really hard on me. But I go to school, and I didn't have that compassionate, loving, caring teacher. I didn't get that encouragement at school like I hope most kids get in their situations. My kindergarten teacher was tough. She was mean. I don't know even to this day if she loved what she was doing. I felt like more of a burden than anything. I felt like, oh, I can't make anybody happy at home, and they're too busy for me. And then I come to school, and it's like if I mess up, I felt like I was just constantly being critiqued, and I wasn't getting that encouragement of like, hey, you'll get it next time, or hey, we're going to keep working on that, So I was just in this tricky time. I was in this tricky season. My kindergarten experience was just hard. It was hard. I remember one time advocating for myself. We were all sitting on the circle rug, and it was the first time that I had ever gotten in trouble in school. And we were sitting on the circle rug, and one of my classmates had to get stitches in his head, and they were creeping me out, you guys. It was gory. It was gross. Like his head was shaved. You could see where the stitches were. It was circle time, and we were doing like the calendar and weather for the day. And I remember he just kept like moving it closer to me and trying to get me to look at his stitches. And he kept like kind of just annoying me with it and like putting it in my face. And I remember like talking and just saying, stop, like, I don't want to see that. And I got in trouble for talking, and I had to get up in front of the class and walk over and sit in the timeout chairs for talking. But if I would have just been understood, if the situation would have been understood, it would have came down to the fact that like I was just advocating for myself. And then I was always anxious. I was always so worried that I was going to get in trouble and have to go to that timeout chair that I just stopped speaking up, that I just didn't say anything, and I would just deal with things because I didn't want to get in trouble, even though I was doing what I should have been doing. I should have said, hey, that's creeping me out. Like, please stop. But instead of that teacher taking the time to say like, okay, what's really going on in that situation? She just seen me speak out when I wasn't supposed to. I was supposed to be quiet and paying attention. And she pulled me out and put me in timeout. And that was like a public humiliation. Nobody wants to be the timeout kid. Nobody wants to get in trouble. Nobody wants the whole class to think that they did something wrong. So that right there caused even more anxiety. So I was scared to go to school. I was scared to do something wrong. I was scared to be corrected, but I was also scared to be at home with a grandmother who would like get her flip-flop out and beat me with it. So there was just so many different things. I was pulled in so many different directions. I remember another time, I can't tell you what exact month it was in my kindergarten year, but I remember another time I was lining up to put some stuff in my cubby, and all the kids were going to their cubbies. And I remember it was crayons. I mean, all the cubbies were lined up on one side, and I had a box of crayons in my hand, and I was going over to put my crayons away just like everybody else. But the teacher must have thought that I was a little bit too close to the other kids, or I was trying to like bud my way in. And I remember this. I can see it if I close my eyes to this day. I remember just standing there, just kind of waiting. And maybe I was a little bit closer to the kids in front of me, and it looked like I was like pushing my way through, but I definitely wasn't. I was just waiting my turn to get to my cubby. And my kindergarten teacher came up and put her hands on my shoulder and grabbed me and pulled me back and told me that I needed to wait my turn. And she physically hurt me. Like, she put her hands on me and pulled me back. And it wasn't just like a gentle, like, come on, you need to back up a little bit. Let's give some people some space. It was in a mean enough way that she left marks on my arm from pulling me backwards. I remember later that day when I got picked up from school, my dad picked me up at the time every day. And I don't know how the words came out of my mouth. I mean, I was only about 5 years old, but somehow I had communicated with him that, hey, my teacher pulled me back and yelled at me today because I was, maybe getting too close, or she thought I was shoving other kids or something like that. And he was able to see the marks on my arm. he seen them and he was furious and he was ready to go up to the school and do something about this. Now, I just have to, like, I got to give it the disclosure. This was back in the 1990s. So there were no cell phones. If my dad wanted to go home and take a picture of this mark on my arm, he would have had to go home, take the picture, send the film out, and maybe there was 1 hour photo delivery or photo development at the time, but that wasn't the case. It wasn't just as easy as taking a picture on a smartphone. So I remember my dad whirling and twirling and trying to decide what he was going to do. And he has his own side of the story on that. But I do know he got in touch with my mom and they were ready to go up to the school to say something. But by the time that they were ready to go and say something about it, the marks had started to fade. So the marks were prominent enough to be there probably for over an hour, I would say. I don't recall what time of the day that incident happened in the classroom, but it was long enough for that to happen and then for them to be there by the time my dad picked me up. So they decided, I believe at the time, just to kind of let it go and to monitor the situation. So they knew that school was hard for me. I don't think they knew how hard my relationship was with my grandma at the time because she was helping them out so much. I think they just took her help, but they never really dug into how hard that relationship was there or how mean she was to me at home. So they did know that school was hard for me. So they finished out that year in kindergarten and I went ahead and moved on to the first grade. I was really excited about my first grade teacher. She was great. She was young. She was newer to the school district. I think I was probably one of the first few classes that she had ever taught. And so she was different than kindergarten. But I tell you what, every time I walked by that kindergarten classroom to go to the library, their computer lab, I would instantly get anxiety. Like it was the best possible thing for me to move from kindergarten to first grade. I don't remember as much separation anxiety going into first grade. I actually enjoyed going to school. I would go to my classroom. I was excited. I don't remember dreading getting on the bus or anything like that. There wasn't the tears or anything because I actually got to go to school and I was excited. I was in a good classroom. But at that time, you didn't start reading in kindergarten. You started reading when you were in first grade. That's when I realized that I was going to struggle with reading. I mean, I just knew it was harder for me. I knew other kids would sit down and we'd go around the classroom and everybody would read a line from the book. And when it get to me, I'd fumble and jumble over all the words and I would struggle. So that was identified by that teacher pretty early on. And I would get pulled from that classroom and they would take me out and I'd have an aide that I'd work with. I can't remember how often that happened or anything. I do remember my parents sitting down and they thought that, you know, maybe I needed an IEP, an individual like education plan, where I was going to need a little bit of extra support. So reading was hard from the get-go for me. I struggled with it. So that continued on where they would pull me out of the classroom during different subjects. It seemed like a lot of the reading and language arts sections of the day where I would be pulled out and I'd get additional support. That worked well. I mean, it was great that I had a tutor and the tutors would always say, like, she knows what she's doing when she's working in a one-on-one section. She comprehends it. She can understand it. So that was good. But the thing was, is that the school district that I was in, they didn't have any rhyme or reason for their day. The teachers taught all the subjects. You didn't switch classrooms. So yes, my tutor would come and get me and pull me out for the language arts section and teach me language arts. But my teachers would end up teaching like the math lesson of the day. So then I would miss that subject. And then when I go back in, they would do the language arts section again. The teacher would be teaching language arts. So I get language arts 2 times a day, but I would have missed the math lesson. So then I would get sent home with math homework and I wouldn't know what I was doing because I missed the math lesson because I got reading twice that day. And it was just a cycle of where my homework would come home and the teachers would assign this homework and I would tell my parents, I don't know what I'm doing. And I don't know what I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know how to do that problem because I wasn't in the classroom today. And of course, I mean, I'm a parent now and I know by the end of the day, you don't want to do homework. My heart goes out to all the parents out there because I get frustrated with homework. So my parents would work all day long and then they'd send me to this private school where they paid good money for me to go to. And I'd come home and I'd be the difficult child that needed help with their homework. I needed extra support. I didn't know what I was doing. And I would tell them, I don't know what I'm doing. And they're like, how don't you know what you're doing? You were at school all day long. And I don't think at the time that I realized that I was even missing subjects in school to go out and get my other services, but I was. So that was a really frustrating time for my parents. So it was just this cycle of I go to school, I would, get my help. It was a little bit better in first grade, but then I come home and then the tension in my education was at home. That's when it was more frustrating. I knew that my parents were going to end up yelling at me because they'd be frustrated that I couldn't focus on my homework. I wouldn't know what I was doing. That was like a rough cycle right there. So now that school was smooth for me, my education, when it carried over to home, that was hard. So not only was I being pulled out for services and having to go with a special tutor for like my reading and everything like that, I knew at the time that I was one of few kids. I think there was maybe only one other boy in my class that had to go out and get special help. But I just knew I was different. I always felt so much shame and embarrassment when I would have to leave the classroom and go out. There were these trailers in this parking lot, you guys. This is how funny and how much I can remember it. But there was these trailers in this parking lot that the school had. It was like their classrooms. And I would have to cross the street and go over to these little trailers and spend my entire morning in these special classrooms and learn. And I was so embarrassed because it's like, that's where the kids that were stupid, and I'm saying that with quotes for those of you guys who can't see the video that goes along with this audio, but I was going where all the stupid kids went. I was going to like the stupid building, and I labeled it that way in my own head because that's how I viewed myself. Nobody was telling me that I was smart, and nobody told me that I just needed a little extra help. Nobody ever told me any of that. I labeled it that way, and I felt so much shame and embarrassment walking across the street and going over to that little trailer classroom and being out of my class with all my peers all morning long, and they were all playing and bonding and doing things together and getting to know each other. And then I would come back after being over there for a couple hours and I would be with the class the rest of the day. It was just a really strange time. So I know that the classmates in this school, they knew that I was only in the classroom 50% of the time. I think at a younger age, maybe they didn't know why I wasn't in the classroom for certain subjects. But eventually, I mean, by the time I got to third, fourth, fifth grade, I mean, they would have had to have known, hey, she's struggling. She needs extra help in this area. And that's why she's going. So maybe it is because she's not as smart as us, or maybe it is because she doesn't understand, or maybe it is because something's wrong with her. So I started developing a lot of anxiety around that. I was really embarrassed. I hated being pulled from my classroom and having to go somewhere else. I hated the fact that, I was different than all the other kids. All I wanted was to just be just like them. And I felt like it just put a label right on my back. Like, there goes the stupid girl. And there she is, there she goes, and we're different than her, and maybe we're a little bit better. Even to this day, I'm sure if you went back to some of those classmates that I went to elementary school with, they would probably be able to say, like, use 5 words to identify Nicole Luna. Maybe they would remember, or maybe it's just my visual of it, my twisted image of it, that they would remember that about me. Maybe they were just so busy and they didn't even know it. But I don't know. I'm curious. I wonder if they actually remember that being me, or if they would label me as that. And if they did, then so what? Because I've already thought in my mind for all these years that that's how they would remember me. So this went on for many years. It went on for many years. The school was trying to help me. They took me out, they gave me an IEP. They were trying to, but I was still struggling a lot. Like, reading was still hard. Ended up being given like a separate spelling list than the kids in my classroom. And I had a separate teacher who was like assigned to me to grade me on my language arts, who was assigned to me to grade me on my reading and all of that stuff. And when she was assigned to me, she just pretty much made up her own curriculum. So she was teaching me something different than what the other classroom teacher was teaching. So like I said, she made up her own spelling list for me. She made up her own reading for me. So I was off of what the kids in the classroom were doing. They had separate spelling lists. So I was getting different words than they were. And then I would go on to the next grade level, and that teacher would have expected me to be able to spell a word. And then here I was trying to like catch up back and forth. It was so difficult. And now looking at it now, I do get a little frustrated that there were so many gaps, and that like I wasn't taught the same curriculum, and I wasn't being taught like to the standard which I feel like I should have been taught to. But it is something that I have been able to adapt and move on from and grow with. But I just feel like I was kind of given the short end of the stick there. They were trying, but what they didn't help me as much as what I think that they could have. Not only was I in these classes, and I'll call them LD classes, maybe learning disabled classes or something like that it might stand for, but I just remember the word LD. coming up a lot when I was younger. So I was in these LD classes, and the school that I went to told my parents that, that I was in these LD classes and there was just no way out of them pretty much. Even if I wanted to go back in fourth or fifth grade to just the regular classroom and not having the assistance and not having the IEP, I kept telling my parents, like, I don't know if I need it. Can I just go back to the regular classroom and be with all the other kids? And they're like, the school pretty much told them no, that there was no way that I was ever going to get back to the regular classroom. Now, somewhere, I don't know when the conversation ever happened, but my parents found out that the private school that I went to, had to have so many kids on IEPs in order to get state funding. And I was one of the butts in that seat. I was one of those numbers. I was one of those kids that got the IEP, and they weren't going to let me off of it, because if they dropped below so many numbers, they wouldn't get state help anymore. So they labeled me with this IEP, gave me this IEP, and I was going to be stuck with it from there on out. I believe it was probably about fifth grade when things were getting even worse. Things were getting even just more broken, and just things weren't lining up right. I think at that time I was finally able to communicate with my parents, like, I don't know how to do my math homework, because they taught the math lesson while I was out in the trailer getting my reading help. And my parents were like, what do you mean you weren't in math class today? No, Mom and Dad, I wasn't in math class today. I don't know how to do that, because my teacher taught that subject when I wasn't there. And then I think my parents started seeing that things just weren't lining up right. Like, I was missing subjects, and maybe I wasn't getting all the help I needed. So that's when they decided to give me a fresh start. There were probably a handful of other things that contributed to this, but it was discussed that I would actually switch to the public school. And I think I kind of have this like visual of private and public schools. Like, you'd think that public schools are not going to give you as much support as what you need, and private schools are the way to go, because you're actually paying for them, and like there's smaller class sizes and all these things. But when my parents made that decision to pull me out of the private school and send me to a public school, it was by far the best thing that my parents could have ever done for me and my education. So I was switched to a public school halfway through my fifth grade year. I remember I started right after Martin Luther King Day in my fifth grade year. My new public school adopted my IEP. So since it was halfway through the calendar year, they just took the documentation that the private school gave them, and they adapted that and adopted that for me. So when I first started going to the public school, I had to be pulled out, and I would go to a special class for my reading and language arts. They didn't want to change everything up and just erase all of that, because that's how I came in. And they told my parents, like, we're going to just see how this goes. We're going to evaluate her in our building and against these standards. And we're just going to treat her as an individual, and we're just going to see how this goes. And lo and behold, I only remember going to that classroom for extra help in my reading and language arts for a very, very short period of time. It was not something I needed to do. And I remember I had a male teacher when I would go over and get that extra help and extra assistance in that subject. And I remember him saying to me one time, like, I don't know why you're here. I don't think you need my help. I think you could keep up in a regular classroom. And when he said that, I instantly got some self-confidence. So it wasn't too long after that, my parents were approached and they said, hey, I think she can hang out in a regular classroom. I think she can get this, and she's going to be able to understand this. So my IEP was dropped, and I no longer needed to be sent out for extra help. So from there on out, I was in the classroom with all of my peers, all of my classmates from there on for every subject. I do think they kept an eye on me for a little while just to make sure I didn't fall behind, but I never ended up needing an IEP after that. So even though I got to go back to the regular classroom with all the other kids, I still had a hard time with reading. It took a lot more work for me. I remember, maybe you recall, when you're sitting in your classroom and you're reading, and each person has an assigned paragraph, and then you go to the next kid, and then you go to the next kid. I remember like counting out what paragraph that I would have to read, and if we get off track, or if the teacher would go a different way, or however it would happen, if I got assigned a paragraph that I didn't get to read 500 times before it got to me, I remember panicking. There was so much anxiety. I hated reading out loud in class. I hated it. So when I would read out loud in class, I would stumble over my words. I didn't know words. I mispronounced them. I would skip lines or skip ahead, or just all of these things were happening. I was able to read enough to where I could pick out keywords and kind of piece it together, but reading was never smooth for me. When I would look at a line in a book, it almost looked like the words were moving around, and it wasn't like my vision and my eyes were bad, but it looked like the words were moving around, or I just couldn't track it. I couldn't follow it. So I spent a lot of time using my finger and moving my finger along on the page. Just any little tricks and things that I could do in order to try to comprehend what I was reading. I had a ton of anxiety about reading in my classroom. I didn't like to read out loud. It always scared me. I always felt like I was ridiculous when I was trying to read in front of the class, and everybody would like laugh and snicker. And if I would sit there and have to sound out a word, it was so embarrassing. I don't know if anyone else can relate to that, but that was my life. But over time, I figured out ways for myself to adapt with this. And I think eventually, I just dealt with it. Like, I wouldn't get myself so anxious, and I would just go really slow, and I'd almost like sound out each word individually. Like, I wouldn't try to just make it super flowy. I would focus on each and every word. And even to this day, if I am trying to read something that is in print, I will look at each individual word, and I have to say it real slow so that I don't skip anything. So I knew that everything just looked all scrambled to me, but I didn't understand why. I'm like, why does it flow so well for them? And how do they have this like great like flow where they don't miss words, but I'm missing words, and it's taken me a while to get things figured out. So I knew that there was something a little different, but I had no idea what it was. Now, I struggled to read. I didn't like reading. I didn't really like any of the books that the schools assigned. I struggled with reading, but somehow, by the grace of God, I got through all of my reading classes. I was able to read enough to pass the language arts classes. I was able enough to write the book reports. I did all of that stuff, but I still didn't enjoy reading. It was such a burden to me, such a burden to me. But I do remember I was in high school at the time that I had a teacher that would give us like 20 minutes of reading time. And she had this bookshelf with all these books lined up, and you could either go and bring your own book in, or you could go to the bookshelf and pick a book. Well, one day I didn't have a book with me, so I had to go to the bookshelf and pick a book. And there was this book that came up, and I believe the name was like Eye of a Tiger or something. And I picked that book off the bookshelf, and I went and sat down, and the book was talking about like this little boy who was abused. And I don't know why I was drawn to that book. I just picked it up, and I remember sitting down, and they were all to the level of the grade I was in. I'm pretty sure I was like a freshman at the time that this happened. And so it was like supposed to be a freshman reading level. And I remember sitting down and reading that book and opening it up and actually like being able to breeze through it. And when she said that it was 20 minutes up and it was time to put your book down, I was like, no, I don't want to stop reading. Like, I am so into this book, and I'm actually comprehending it, and I'm like turning the page, and I'm like wanting to see what the next words are going to hold. And I'm like, I remember like having to put that book back on the bookshelf and praying that nobody else would take it the next day, because I wanted to go back and get that book when it was time. So she had like, this book came in like a series of 3. And I remember that I wouldn't bring a book to class anymore. I just wanted her book off the bookshelf. So I ended up zipping through all of those books with no trouble. And then it got me thinking, I'm like, I can read. I can understand, I can comprehend. It just has to be something that I am interested in. It has to be something like a passion, like a topic that I'm into, or it has to be a subject that like, it's just really like captivating. Like, I get this. Like, if you give me like a William Shakespeare book, I could care less about that. But if you give me a history book on a topic that I want to learn, I'm going to read it all. So at that time in my life as like a high schooler, I realized like, I can read, I just need to read what I want to read. And if I'm not reading something that I'm interested in, so I learned that I was able to read. It wasn't that I couldn't, it was just I was going to have to read and learn differently. I definitely found my coping ways to deal with this. I learned how little tricks that would work for me. I I was just at that point starting to realize that there were audio versions available for things. So if like the teachers assigned a book, I would see if I could get the audio of it so that I could listen to it instead of having to sit and read it. I'm a very big visual learner, even to this day. Please let me see something if you want me to understand it. Don't just explain and expect me to go, but if you can actually like show me how it needs to go, I'm going to understand it so much more. So I started learning all of these little tricks, just little things to get me through. And this continued on. Somehow I coped and I got through high school. I remember I passed my Ohio graduation test the first time. So I was able to read those questions. I was able to read those questions and be able to like put it into place and pass that test. And I take pride in that because here I was a kid that I didn't think I was going to be able to read, but somehow I got to pass these graduation tests in my very first time. And that instilled me with some confidence. Like that test was hard because I had to like sit there and take so much more time to read those questions, but I was able to pass things. I was able to do things. I was smart enough to know the answers. So I coped and I got through high school, and then I did what was the next expected thing, and that was to go off to college. And I remember all my prerequisite undergrad classes, they were just so boring to me, and I found myself struggling again in college. I had taken this summer online reading course. I don't know why. I'm pretty sure I took it just to get the financial aid over the summer months, but I took this like literature class, and it was all about shipwrecks, and it was so dreadful. It was about the Great Lakes and ships on the Great Lakes. It was dreadful. And I remember having these books that I was supposed to be reading over the summer, and I'm like, I can't read. And I was so intimidated again. And I just realized like, I'm not a good reader and I don't like this. And I wasn't enjoying a single class I was taking in college besides my psychology class. So I just pretty much put reading on the back burner again. I wasn't interested in books in my my late teens and early 20s. If you would have told me to pick up a book and read it, I probably would have laughed in your face because I was once again just not into reading. So my college journey is a whole nother story for a whole nother time into why I didn't end up finishing college. But I realized that I just needed to learn differently. Tell you what, if you gave me a documentary, holy cow, I would fly through that. If I could sit and watch a documentary or a show on the History Channel or something in science, like I would understand it, I comprehend it, I could tell somebody else about it. But if you gave me a book and told me to read it, or a whole chapter to read and then tell me what happened or whatever, I was just not into it. So one of the things that I was completely intimidated by was the Bible. I mentioned this a little bit in my faith journey, that I did not understand the Bible that was taught to me in my PSR classes. I did not comprehend it. It was like Shakespeare meets the Bible, and I didn't understand the words. So one of the things that I was just totally opposed to reading was the Bible. I didn't understand the King James Version, and so I thought every Bible was that same exact way. And since I didn't understand it and I already struggled with reading print, that I was never just ever going to be able to get into the word, and I was just never going to be able to understand the Bible. So in my adult life, I ended up joining a business, and they talked a ton about self-development. And I go to these conferences and people would like list off all these books. Like, you should read The Miracle Morning. You should read How to Win Friends and Influence People. You should read this book. You should read that book. And I'm like, I can't read, but I just kept hearing these people talk about these books that I should be reading. So I'm like, well, what else is there out there for me? So, there were obviously audiobooks all along where you could go to the library and rent audiobooks. And that's what I do back in high school, is I'd rent the audiobook from the library. But things were evolving, and I found out that there was like Audible, where you could listen to books and do them right from your phone. So I was really excited about that. And I remember the first few books that I went through, I listened on audio, and I was excited because I didn't have to take that time and sit down and struggle to comprehend and read and reread things. I actually could get through an audiobook and like comprehend it, know it, and be able to do it like while I was washing the dishes, or while I was walking the dog, or while I was driving in the car. So I got really, really, really into audiobooks in my early 20s. And I joke to this day that I struggle reading, but I finish more books than most people do. I finish more books in a month than some people finish in a year. So I was no longer scared of books. I actually realized that books had a lot of valuable information. I just had to find out how to put those books into work in my life. How can I get what is contained in the pages of that books and be able to understand it in my own way? Then it was later on, gosh, it was probably only a couple years ago. I remember a post coming across Facebook. It was a guy that I follow. He has a lot of great social media tips and everything. And he posted about how he learns different and about how words were always hard for him. And I started thinking like, okay, maybe it's not just me. Why are words so hard for me? What is the reason behind this? Why do I struggle with reading? Why do I feel like the words are moving around on the page? And why do I skip words and all of these things? So he kind of sparked my interest into like, maybe I'm not the only one that struggles with this. And why is it such a breeze for everybody else, but it's hard for me? So I started doing some research and I started Googling because that's what everybody does when they want to find out stuff. So I started Googling and I came across the word dyslexia. And I was like, what is this? And is this something that I have? Okay, and so when you Google it and you come up with the definition of dyslexia, it says dyslexia is a learning disability in reading. People with dyslexia have trouble reading at a good pace without making mistakes. They also may have a hard time reading comprehension, spelling, and writing. These challenges aren't a problem with intelligence. And when I read that, holy cow, you guys, holy cow, it changed so much. Dyslexia. I had a word for what I was going through. And I have to laugh a little bit because you guys caught that in a recording. I was reading that definition and you could hear me stumble over the words a little bit. So I seriously sat there and stared at every single word while I was reading that definition to you, but you can also see that I stumbled over the words a little. But when I read that, especially the last line years ago, when I first found this word and I realized that there was something that I was struggling with, but these challenges aren't a problem with intelligence. I finally realized that I wasn't stupid, that I was smart, that I could understand things, that I was teachable, that I could have an education. It had nothing to do with my intelligence level. I just had dyslexia and I had a hard time with reading and letters and sometimes even numbers. Now, this would have saved me a world of hurt in my early 20s. This would have saved me so much pain. Like, I probably shouldn't have taken a job in banking knowing that I had dyslexia. And I remember one time, actually, it's funny that I'm even recalling this right now. I remember one time working in the hardware store when I was a teenager, and somebody's bill was like $14.60. And I said to them, your bill is $41.60. And they're like, $41? Like, no, you got that backwards. I'm like, oh, wait. Yeah, you're right. $14, not 41. And they're like, you got dyslexia, like you read that backwards. And I remember hearing that word that one time way back then, but I never dug into it. But I remember every time that I catch myself, even in banking where I'd say numbers backwards, or if I was checking somebody out in a different job and I'd say numbers backwards, I'd be like, oh yeah, I'm sorry, I have dyslexia. And I never dug into what it was. So I didn't even really know what it meant. But when I found out that there was an actual thing, I felt so much hope. I felt like, wow, I felt like there was just so much hope. Like there was a reason behind why I was struggling for all of these years. So I really started just digging into it and realizing that I'm just different. I learn different. I'm not LD learning disabled. I am learning different. So that's how I identify it to myself. I'm not like a special needs. I just need things a little bit different. I need things special. I took this education and this knowledge that I learned about dyslexia and I just turned it into my superpower. I hit the ground running. I realized that, you know what, I cannot let this stop me from being educated. I just have to learn different ways of educating myself. And it gave me almost like a desire and a fire to be more educated on so many topics. Like I wanted to get through more audiobooks. I wanted to be able to know more topics more in depth. I didn't want my dyslexia to limit me from having knowledge any longer. And it like created this wildfire in me that I was like thirsty. Like I could not wait to consume the next piece of knowledge that was out there. it was like the stars aligned. I had never knew that I had a word that went along with this, that there were other people out there that struggled with the same thing. I just thought that I was broken and that I was ridiculous and I couldn't be taught. I was always going to struggle with this. But this instant thing, just knowing that there are other people out there like me, like it gave me so much hope. Now, there's no cure for dyslexia. There's obviously coping things out there. And they say like tutoring and special help and just slowing down. And I've mentioned I'm a visual learner. There are things out there. But I'm telling you what, like to this day, I know how to cope with it. I know how to read and I know what I need to do to get the information I need to get, but I don't let it hold me back anymore. For example, I just passed my insurance and license exam, and they don't offer a different exam for people with dyslexia. You have to like take the same test everybody else takes. But I was able to read, do all that prior studying. I was able to do all that with my dyslexia and pass my insurance exam because I just learned how to adapt it to myself. And just little things like that, proving to myself, like I passed my driver's exam. I was able to read those questions on that screen and pass my driver's written exam. I just had to read it differently. I had to do what was going to work for me. So I was learning ways to cope with this even before I had a word that went along with my disability. And maybe it's not even just being disabled, it's being differently abled. So yeah, I could probably be mad at the teachers that they didn't identify this. I mean, I don't know. I didn't become a teacher, so I don't know what they actually teach in college. I don't know if they actually teach on different learning disabilities or how people learn differently. But I wish that in my elementary years that this would have been identified by my teachers. I mean, I could be salty and say they should have known this. Like maybe they should have dug into it a little bit more. But it is what it is. It unfolded the way it did. So I just go along with it at this point and I say, you know what? God had me go on this journey and has me learning different than other people for a reason. And I'm just going to embrace that. I am very thankful that now I just know how to deal with it. And I also am so glad that a lot of the information that out there says that this is not a problem with intelligence, because for a really long time I had a low self-esteem thinking that it was based on my intelligence, but it's not. And I just have to constantly remind myself that I am smart. So I mentioned one of the things before, I was so scared to even get into my Bible. For the longest time, even after being a Christian, people would say they read their Bible, they read their Bible. And I'm like, there's just no way I'm going to be able to read my Bible. When I started going to the non-denominational church that I attend now, I realized that they did not read the King James Version. They read a different version of the Bible. And I could actually understand what that was saying. So all these different translations are out there and they're available. And I couldn't let that Shakespeare King James Version stop me from being able to read the Bible. So I have just recently started getting into the Word of God and sitting down for myself. But let me tell you how I read the Bible. So I have a NIV Life Application Study Bible. This is my Bible right here. And it's NIV, so it's a New International Version. So it is translated into pretty much modern day English, something that I can understand and relate to. And then I have a study Bible, which means that at the bottom of each page, it breaks down and gives you additional stuff to read. And it helps you understand what's being said in that scripture. It gives you a lot of context on the location and other ways to, understand things and just other definitions of things. So I have a study Bible, which has helped me so much. But here's the kicker, you guys. I do sit down and I read my Bible, but how I read it is I have the YouVersion Bible app on my phone and I go to the Bible and I go to the same chapter that I'm in and I have it read me the audio version while I'm following along in my written book. So I have the audiobook playing. It's the same exact version that I have in my actual physical Bible, and I read it word for word and follow along. And then I pause it and I go down and I read the study notes at the bottom. This is how I read my Bible. And it's so different. And then, yes, it takes so much more work and it's not traditional. And it's just weird probably that I have to have the audio version go along with it. But this is the only way. This is the only way that I have been able to get as far as what I have. And this is the only way that I can consume as many books as I do. And this is the one way that I have gained as much knowledge as what I have. And I just have to say, I mean, this is all coming back to like, I was so hurt by this. I was so hurt by being different. I was so hurt by being struggling so much in this area. I mean, I labeled myself more than what anybody else probably labeled me. I disqualified myself more than what anybody had disqualified me. But I have now been able to find so much hope and so much light and so much encouragement now that I have worked on this, you guys. I have grown from this. I mean, sometimes I'd like to think like, hey, go back and tell that younger version of myself, like, you are smart and there's a word for what you are struggling with. And there's other people out there struggling with the same thing. But God had me go on this journey for a reason. So that's why I'm here. And I want to share this message. I know that this isn't something that everybody struggles with. Maybe you don't have dyslexia and you don't even know what I'm understanding, which in dyslexia, like the words do move around on you while you're following them and you're trying to read them. Like it's something between your brain and the page and all these things. There's a whole science behind actually what's going on in your brain when it's happening. Maybe you don't have dyslexia and you're not struggling with reading, and maybe you're a great reader, but maybe there's another area in your life where you just feel completely inadequate with. I felt inadequate with reading. I didn't think I was ever going to be able to read, and I never was going to be able to get through a book or never be able to comprehend things. And maybe that's something, maybe it's a different area in your life. This area in my life caused me so much hurt. I disqualified myself from applying for certain job positions because of this disability. I disqualified myself from going out for different opportunities because of this. But here I am. I host a podcast. I speak for a living. I teach people about all kinds of stuff, and I talk about all different topics, and I write things out. And I'm going to throw this out there. If you ever happen to find one of my social media posts that have like a typo in it, yes, I have dyslexia. I struggle with typing and I struggle with writing as well. So I don't communicate in writing as much because I'm so scared that I'm going to have a flaw and I'm going to have a typo in there. I'm going to miss a word or something's going to be spelled in incorrectly. I am worried about that, but I am just embrace it and I just kind of go with it. And I have just started realizing this is who I am, and I am uniquely and wonderfully made. Like God gave me this for a reason. And I know that the enemy tried to destroy me with the lie that I was stupid and that I wasn't capable, but I am just embracing this from here on out. And maybe it's like not the same area in your life, but this is who I am. This is just part of who I am. And I just want you to know that if you are struggling with something in your life, it's not hurtful to dig into it a little bit more to try to find if there's a reason or a word or other people who are struggling with it, because that is really what's helped me start getting through it. And also just realizing that God created you the way you are. Maybe it's something in your health that you struggle with, or maybe it's something in your emotions and your mental health that you struggle with, but just know that you were created on purpose for a purpose. And yes, there are days that I pray that I'm like, oh gosh, I hope my kids don't have this because I don't want them to struggle as much as what I did. But then I also think, you know what, maybe they will struggle, but I know how far I've been able to come, you guys. I have been able to have a career, and I've been able to start a ministry, and I've been able to do all these things with this disability that I know my kids and other people will be able to overcome it as well. And I kind of often joke, Brad has his own story on this, but I often joke, you had these two kids that both had IEPs in school, that both struggled, that people probably looked at and thought like, man, they're never going to be anything in their life. And I'm like over here like, yeah, like we did this. Like we were smart enough to start our own businesses, and we have these careers. I mean, we're homeowners, we're parents, we have careers, we have businesses. We've been able to, by society standards, be able to become successful people. And we were the underdogs. People probably would have counted us down and out way back years ago. I mean, go back and ask those classmates who we were back in school, and they would tell you like they were the failures. They were never going to get anywhere in life. But God created us so unique and so different, but he also still created us perfect in our own ways. And we've been able to overcome those struggles and to push through and still end up where we are today because of that. So the verse I want to leave you guys with today is in Philippians, and it's, I can do all things. Like I can read, I can run a business, I can pass a test, I can comprehend, I can do all things. So I don't know what that is for you guys, but just please remember that you can do all things too. Maybe dig into that a little bit more. This area of my life has caused me so much hurt and so much insecurity, and it has taken a toll on my self-confidence. But maybe you'll go away from this and thinking this is this crazy girl and her intellectual level is way down low and she doesn't comprehend things, and I need to stop following her because she isn't smart enough, she isn't the smartest one out there, she isn't the smartest kid in the classroom. But I'm just throwing myself out there. This is who I am. This is something that I have had to work through. And if this has encouraged you in any way, that's the only thing that I could ever pray. So thank you for hanging out during this episode of the podcast. I cannot wait to share some of the upcoming interviews that I've been working on with you guys. If you have a chance and you want to go ahead and share this episode or leave a review on the podcast, that would be amazing. This podcast is really picking up in the snowball speed of things, and it is just growing and growing, and it's impacting more lives than what I could have ever prayed or ever imagined. So thank you guys so much for your loyalty. It means so much to me, and it just gives me so much more of a drive to keep going, because I hope this is helping you guys go from hurt to hope in your life as well. Until next time.